Chapter 5, Elasticity, the willingness to be stretched. When was the last time you were really stretched? I'm not talking about weird goat yoga where your body is contorted in different animal positions for comfort. I've never understood where comfort comes into yoga, but don't hate on me. What I'm referring to is emotional stretching, where you are pushed to your limits of comfortability, causing you to be, uncomfortable. This is elasticity, the ability to allow yourself to be stretched by others. Several people throughout time have talked about this type of stretching. Ken Poirot, author and mentor, said this: "True success is achieved by stretching oneself, learning to feel comfortable being uncomfortable." Charles Swindoll, one of my personal favorites, says that alleged impossibilities are opportunities for our capacities to be stretched. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., an acting Chief Justice in 1930, says it this way: "A mind that is stretched by a new experience can never go back to its old dimensions." So the idea of being stretched has intrigued many people over the years, and many have spoken about the need for elasticity to achieve success. It seems as if Jesus was constantly doing this with his disciples, or even the crowds that seemed to surround him when he was teaching. Many times, he would thin out the crowds by stretching their thoughts. When he told people to deny themselves, take up their crosses, and follow him, many would be very uncomfortable with that thought. The idea of putting yourself behind everyone else, even to the point of sacrificing yourself and your needs, was very foreign to the culture of that day. Jesus was very specific with Peter about how he would develop elasticity in his life. In John chapter 21, he says, "I'm telling you the very truth now. When you were young, you dressed yourself and went wherever you wished, but when you get old, you'll have to stretch out your hands while someone else dresses you and takes you where you don't want to go." He said this to hint at the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And he commanded him, "Follow me." That's verses 18 and 19. You may know that history records that Peter was crucified in the same way that Jesus was, but with one exception. He asked to be crucified upside down so that he could honor Jesus by not duplicating what he did. Peter truly did stretch out his hands and had someone take him to a place he did not want to go, and in doing so, followed Jesus even to the ultimate sacrifice. As I was preparing this thought about elasticity, I began to meditate on this verse and think about what Jesus really meant in this comment, not just to Peter, but to us. As Christians, we will be asked to stretch out our hands in many ways that we may not be comfortable with. This stretching may take us to places like prisons, like it did me, or to a homeless shelter, or maybe even an AIDS clinic. It might even take us to sharing the message of God with the people next door to us. The key point of Jesus' message, though, is found in two simple words that he left him with: follow me. Anytime we are stretched in our thinking or values, we must be sure that we're following Jesus as we contemplate our next moves in elasticity. A rubber band can be stretched to great lengths, but can only go so far before it snaps. We must make sure that our stretching does not take us past a place that could snap our spiritual values. If we follow Jesus and his commands, we can protect ourselves. We have already seen that Jesus was very good at stretching people, especially his disciples. Looking at the life of Peter, we see that Jesus knew Peter needed to be stretched and to develop more elasticity as he followed him. From the very beginning of the ministry of Peter, Jesus began by teaching him that he needed to let go of a few hindrances. In developing elasticity, the first thing Peter needed was to let go of his own agenda. Peter was a fisherman, and his family heritage was fishing. When Jesus called him, he had just finished a full night of successful fishing, non-successful fishing. And when he finished teaching, it says to Simon, "Push out into deep water and let your nets out for a catch." And Simon said, Master, we've been fishing hard all night and haven't even caught a minnow. But if you say so, I'll let out the nets. And it was no sooner said than done. A huge haul of fish, straining the nets past capacity. They waved to their partners in the other boat to come help them, and they filled both boats, nearly swamping them with the catch. That's Luke chapter 5, verses 4 through 7. There is nothing worse as a fisherman than coming home empty-handed, especially when you are an expert at fishing. Now remember, this is not the multi-million-dollar bass boat, fancy bait-casting reel, giant tackle box full of multicolored lures and plastic worms type of fishing. This was throwing out heavy nets, pulling them up, emptying and sorting, then throwing them out again. Peter and his companions were no doubt exhausted as they pulled up to the shore where Jesus was teaching, and still had to clean nets after all they had done. Peter's agenda at that point was to go home and rest with an empty belly, hoping his fellow fishermen somewhere would help him out. It was only in letting go of his agenda and allowing Jesus to feed him spiritually that he was able to see the catch that he would later have as a disciple. Secondly, in developing elasticity, Peter would need to let go of his own anxieties. As Peter began to follow Jesus, the elasticity that he was developing would take him places that he would be comfortable, or that he should be comfortable, but struggled. He had seen many storms as a fisherman and experienced nearly everything possible on the water. His next experience, though, would take him into a place beyond rationality. In Matthew chapter 14, it says, At about 4 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. They were scared out of their wits. A ghost, they said, crying out in terror. But Jesus was quick to comfort them. Courage. It's me. Don't be afraid. Peter, suddenly bold, said, Master, if it's really you, call me to come to you on the water. And he said, Come ahead. What do you do at that point? Your world has always been about fishing and staying safe inside the boat. Their anxieties were on high alert, and getting out of the boat meant a good possibility of drowning. After all, they thought they had just seen a ghost and were already shaking in their galoshes, sandals. Now, this entity was telling one of their own to step out in elasticity, his mind telling him what would happen, but his heart telling him something else. Do you get out of the boat, or stay in safety, hoping the storm will eventually die down before they're swamped? If we're going to be stretched in our faith, we will have to do the same. We'll have to trust Jesus and leave our place of comfort to develop elasticity in our lives. We will have to let go of our own anxieties about stepping out of our comfort zones so we can show others around us the security we have in the Creator of the storms. When Jesus looks at us and says, Come ahead, we must be ready to step into the waves and know that He will sustain us. We must keep our focus on Him and let go of the anxieties that surround us. The second we begin to look around at everything that could go wrong, we begin to sink again and lose that focus. Lastly, in developing elasticity, Peter would need to let go of his own anguish. As he finished out his time of discipling, Peter would fall back into old patterns of comparison and even jealousy with his fellow disciples. He would even deny Jesus 3 times after Jesus had told him he would do it. And Peter swore that would never happen. The anguish that he felt after the death of Christ must have been smothering to his ego and his emotions, even to the point that he would go back to his old way of life in fishing. Maybe he could alleviate the anguish he felt if he could do something that he was good at and knew something about. At the end of John's Gospel, the disciples experienced a similar situation where they had begun fishing all night with no luck. And after they had felt like failures again and losing their rabbi to the Roman cross, now they failed again in the one area they should all know. And then Jesus happened again, and they hauled in more fish than they could handle. After a short breakfast on the beach, Jesus pulls Peter aside and has an intimate conversation with him. It says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." So we end where we began. Jesus shares with Peter some information that would change his life forever. And the next time we see Peter, he's standing in front of thousands of people proclaiming the gospel. Jesus had reconnected with Peter and given him a sense of intimacy that Peter thought he had lost in his denial. Jesus now gave Peter a purpose that would lead him into becoming an apostle. At one time, this would have been a stretch for Peter, but now he had become a model of elasticity. What does this mean for us? The dictionary definition of elastic is being able to encompass variety and change, flexible and adaptable. If we're going to be open in our brokenness, we're going to have to learn this side of elasticity. We must be able to stretch our arms out and realize that change is good, that when we become flexible and adaptable, we become better people. There are several things that we'll have to recognize in order to allow elasticity in our lives. We will have to recognize that maturity changes us. As we get older, we go one of two ways. We become more open to being stretched, or we close off anything that makes us uncomfortable about being stretched. As Jesus told Peter, when we get older, people may take us in a direction we do not want to go. But if we are willing to be stretched and become more elastic in our thinking, growth can take place. Only in elasticity can we become new people and allow ourselves to develop new ways of thinking. We will have to recognize there are choices we will have to die to, including ourselves. We get comfortable in many lifestyle choices that we're involved in, especially in the areas that are our specialties. These are the choices, though, that get in the way of elasticity and stop us from moving forward. None of these choices may be bad in themselves, but if they stop us from growing in our faith, then we must die to them. This is an extreme thought because anytime something dies, it is gone forever, unless God resurrects it to strengthen us in some way. We will have to recognize that we need to allow others to guide us. We may be surprised at the people who can lead us into truth and stretch us in our thinking. When Jesus was talking to Peter about this, he was referring to people who would be his enemies. What about the people, though, who guide us in a positive mentoring relationship? Everyone should have a mentor who can guide them through life, especially during the tough times. We might be surprised at the people that God brings into our lives to guide us in a direction we never thought we would go. Lastly, we need to recognize that following Jesus should be our number one priority, especially when we're being stretched. The last part of what Jesus said to Peter was, "Follow me." Only in following him can we discern what God's will is for our lives and the areas where we need to become more elastic. If this is our priority, our lives should reflect Jesus and show others that it is okay to be stretched. In order to accomplish any of this, we're going to have to be a part of a culture that allows elasticity. To find this culture, read on. and find where this place exists and how to join this group and get others to join you in this quest.